Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Friday Focus, our new SVA-centric webcast that has replaced our long-running Fang Friday event. This is Ross Healy, the chairman of Strategic Analysis Corporation. Today, I'm going to take a hard look at the implications of Donald Trump's big, beautiful tax bill and show you where it is inexorably leading. I'm going to have to introduce you to a central theorem of our work, and that is what I have labeled here the marginal productivity of debt curve shown on your screen. Individuals, companies, and entire nations adhere to the mathematics of this curve. What it shows is what happens when you add $1 of debt onto an individual, company, a nation. In this case, we are concerned with a nation, the United States. If we go to the far right, here you can see that if you add $1 of debt, you actually get more GDP than that dollar would imply. And that goes up and up and up until it reaches a peak, and then it starts to head down again. Well, who just went through this particular circumstance? Well, of course, it was China. After the death of Mao, it added more and more and more debt onto the Chinese economy, and the economy just exploded. However, it also hit a peak and began to head down. And now the Chinese economy has nearly fallen to, well, you can see here the point at which the curve crosses the zero line. And in other words, adding an additional dollar of debt produces no net GDP growth. Below that, something interesting happens. And that is to say that the economy actually starts to shrink. When that happens, the value of a currency starts to fall. Of course, if the value of the currency is falling, what happens? Prices start to rise. In other words, you get inflation. Well, if you get inflation, then what else do you get? Of course, rising interest rates. Now, that's by way of introduction. Where are we today? To do that, I'm going to look at the U.S. GDP to total debt ratio from 1980, when Ronald Reagan was first elected, to today. And what we see here is that as the U.S. cut taxes, what they didn't do is they didn't cut expenditures. In other words, they simply kept on spending. And the GDP to debt ratio rose and rose and rose and rose. Another way of looking at it, the GDP to total debt ratio actually fell and fell and fell. By 2008, the GDP to debt ratio had fallen down to that 0.289 level that I showed you on the first chart. And in 2008-9, the GDP to debt ratio actually fell into what we call the black hole condition. Well, result? The worst recession that the U.S. had suffered since the Depression. Well, the Fed did its level best and managed to pull the U.S. economy out. It never pulled it back over that 0.289 line. And when you are right there, then you know that you've got very slow GDP growth. If there's no GDP growth, then, of course, you're not going to have inflation, and the U.S. had no inflation. And if you got no inflation, then the interest rate levels are going to drop to zero because there is no growth, there is no inflation, there is really no demand for money, and interest rates fell to zero. Well, that went during the period from 2009 to about 2020 in the COVID recession. The U.S. economy suffered a major setback. In other words, the U.S. economy fell back into the black hole condition. And when it did, inflation soared and interest rates soared. Well, the Fed had to pull them back out again, which they have sort of done. But now we've got Donald Trump and his big, beautiful bill. And what is the point of that? Well, it is to cut taxes. They're not going to cut expenditures, at least not much, certainly not balancing off the loss of the taxes. In other words, then we are going to see an explosion of additional debt on the economy. And when that happens, what I am concerned about is that the U.S. is going to fall into the black hole condition again. And when it does, what we are going to see is an explosion of prices, and we are going to see a systematic rise in inflation, even as the economy continues to slow down. Well, how are we going to survive that condition when it occurs? Next week, what I'm going to be doing is talking about surviving the black hole condition. What works and what does not. How to weather the economic black hole is actually well documented because it has happened some 58 times since 1900. However, you have to accept that is what is happening, and you have to prepare yourself for it. In the meantime, thank you for tuning in today, and I will see you next Friday.